Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2019 Foenander Lecture at the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Business and Economics. I'm Professor Paul Kaufman. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, and it's wonderful to welcome you all here tonight. I would like to begin in our customary way by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which tonight's lecture takes place. So it's great to see you all here connecting with the university and faculty and enjoying our public lecture series. Tonight marks the 33rd Foenander Lecture, a long tradition. Commencing in 1986, the Foenander Lecture was established in memory of Orwell V. Foenander, a former academic at the university who was one of the leading figures in industrial relations scholarship in the early 20th century. Each year, we invite a distinguished figure from government, business, the union movement, or academia to present a lecture on contemporary issues in industrial relations and human resource management. This is a once-in-a-lifetime honor. Speakers cannot and will not be invited to deliver more than one Orwell Foenander lecture. It is appropriate then to make some brief remarks about Mr. Orwell Foenander, in whose honor this lecture series is named. Orwell de Ruyter Foenander was born in 1890, and in 1909 he began a law course at the University of Melbourne. Orwell joined the newly established Faculty of Commerce in 1926 as a part-time lecturer, and by 1954 was appointed the head of the newly formed Department of Industrial Relations. Orwell was the first head of an industrial relations department at any Australian university. Orwell retired from full-time teaching in 1957, but he continued on a part-time basis until his retirement in 1969. His research was focused on the federal system of conciliation and arbitration. His primary focus was on the economic and protective functions of the federal tribunal. Foenander was interested in the role of industrial tribunals to deal with social problems and the role of unions as agents of change. Foenander passed away in 1985. And we commenced this lecture series a year later, funded by a trust set up by his family. The faculty is truly pleased to continue honoring Orwell Foenander's achievements through this lecture series. I would now like to invite my colleague, Professor Peter Gahan, Associate Dean Engagement, to introduce our speaker for the 2019 Foenander Lecture.
Thanks, everybody. Well, welcome, and may I also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which tonight's gathering is taking place, and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present here tonight. It's my great honour to introduce a highly distinguished scholar working broadly in the area of labour economics and industrial relations. I don't really have enough time anywhere to sort of go through exhaustively Michael's contributions to industrial relations and economics. They are extensive. But very briefly, Michael is the David W. Skinner Professor of Political Economy at MIT in Boston. He completed his PhD in economics at Harvard in 1966. He graduated in June. I was born in October. Since then, he has produced a series of studies that have shaped the way industrial relations and labour economists think about how labour markets work and how firms organise employment arrangements. One of his early and highly influential publications, of course, being his book with Peter Dorringer entitled Internal Labour Markets and Manpower Adjustment. Along with a range of papers on the topic of internal labour markets, this book provided a bridge between traditional economic analysis of external labour markets and understanding the internal employment systems of firms and why, despite the fact they may not be produced by market forces, they nonetheless made economic sense. This work was a forerunner to modern economic theory on industrial organisation, to thinking about transaction cost and the role of labour market institutions. And this contribution, a significant one, is just one of many. Over his long lifetime as a scholar, Michael has published on a host of topics: technological change and new production systems, discrimination, migrant labour, the relation between trade and the organisation of work, and labour market segmentation, among many topics. His most recent book, here, entitled Root Cause Regulation, Protecting Work and Workers in the 21st Century, was published in 2018 and adds to that impressive body of scholarship. It starts with a chilling observation that each year work kills more people around the world than do wars. This he attributes to a failure of regulatory enforcement, and the book investigates why regulation is failing and what we can do to ensure labour standards are protected and work is not so deadly for so many. And now, at the very young age of 79 years, Michael is leading a team of researchers examining ecosystems of innovation across the Americas. But tonight, Michael will address another topic. The title for Michael's lecture is Economic Policy in a Time of Reactionary Populism, Consequences for Work and Inequality. So without further ado, please let's welcome Michael Professor Piore to the lectern. Welcome, Michael.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to come to Australia and to give this lecture. Australia is a very, very long way from where I've come from. Exactly how long I wasn't fully aware of until I got here. The distance has led me to wonder whether the topic which I've chosen to talk about this evening is a little parochial. And I don't quite know how to introduce it, whether to say I hope it's parochial because it really focuses on a set of issues which are very painful for where I come from, and I think for much of the rest of the world. And if you people here have managed to escape those issues, you're lucky. But I leave it up to you to see what the real relevance of the remarks I'm about to make are to your own political life. What motivates me in this concern is really the presidential election in the States of 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. And what is particularly concerning, I think, for those of us who are in industrial relations and labor relations, is the way in which the working class electorate, which was once closely tied to the Democratic Party, left the party in order to vote and ultimately became the deciding vote in electing Donald Trump as president. So the question really is, how did that happen? Why did this happen? And what are the implications? And the ostensible reason for why it happened, the immediate reason, is that all the really profound structural adjustment in the U.S. economy over the last 30 years has centered on the old industrial heartland of the Midwest. And it all concentrated in a single region. And ultimately, the people of that region rebelled against the changes which they were forced to bear. So the question of what happened in that election goes to a different question, and that is, how could we have been so indifferent to the structural changes which were taking place in our economy, and how could they have so profoundly and changed ultimately the political climate in the country? And the answer to that, I would like to suggest, lies in something which I am going to call policy paradigms. That is, the frameworks through which we understand the economy, think about its impact on social welfare, and design policy to address the issues which arise. And I would submit to you that in the post-war period in the United States, but also largely in the rest of the world, there have been four dominant paradigms. In the immediate post-war period, there was the Keynesian paradigm. The Keynesian paradigm began in the 1970s to be replaced by what has become known as the Washington Consensus, which is a paradigm or a framework which basically focuses on the market. And it's a kind of market determinism. And then in more recent years, certainly in the last 10 and maybe in 20 years, we've moved away from the Washington Consensus to something which I'm going to call the Silicon Valley Consensus. And it's that consensus and the kind of policies to which it leads that I want to focus on this evening. There's a fourth paradigm which is playing in the background, which is a paradigm of globalization. And in the era of the Washington Consensus, we thought that globalization was being forced upon us, if you will, by the market, essentially. That globalization was a more efficient way to organize the world. In the era of the Silicon Valley Consensus, it's more technology that it seems to be pushing towards globalization. And the idea that changes in transportation and communication costs have moved us into a world market. It's those issues which I think I would like to take issue. It's those contentions which I want to take issue with today, and I want to do it by reviewing what I'm calling the Silicon Valley Consensus. So what is the Silicon Valley Consensus? Well, the mantra of the Silicon Valley Consensus is innovation and entrepreneurship in a knowledge economy. And so what I'd like to look at is each of those elements. The idea is the underlying kind of lesson of the Silicon Valley Consensus is that somehow there's an inevitable movement of the economy towards increasingly high-level, highly skilled, and jobs which demand higher education. And low-skilled, low-wage jobs are going to migrate to the developing world, leaving behind a residual of people who can't find any place in the world that's emerging. So in a way, the Silicon Valley Consensus is a kind of justification for ignoring a set of social issues. And the question is, how justified is that kind of view and in a way, indifference to policy? So I'd like to look at each of these elements of the basic mantra, beginning with innovation, then talking a little bit about the knowledge, the nature of knowledge, and about entrepreneurship. So the problem with innovation and the idea that this is an inevitable part of innovation, that innovation has an inevitable direction, is that innovation is I was going to say almost, but it is by definition, a movement into an unknown world. We don't really know where we're going in terms of innovation. And so the question is, how do a series of people who are responsible for economic decisions, how do they decide or which direction to look for in terms of looking at new technology? How are we going to move? And the result of the fact that everybody is looking and looking harder under the pressures of what we think of as the new economy is looking for what kind of innovation we should be supporting, makes it very subject to fad and to suggestion. And because if you don't know where you're going, you can be safest by going where everybody else is going, rather than trying to figure this out in a new and a different way. So that innovation becomes an idea of where innovation is going becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the idea that we're moving towards a series of innovations that are going to require increasingly high levels of skill and knowledge is, I think, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the idea that it may be not inevitable is suggested by some of the elements of the world which have surrounded this innovation, but which we haven't really seen. There is an almost hysteria about the STEM occupations, that we're not educating enough people in engineering and scientific occupations. And yet the reality is that half of the people who have been educated in science and engineering occupations in the United States are working in other occupations. So there's a whole reservoir of people who could be called in to staff these jobs. But instead, what we seem to be doing is drawing on migration from India and China. And why is there such a reservoir of people in India and China who we can draw on to fill these jobs? It is because India and China and most of the developing world has also overinvested in higher education. And it leads to a situation where we have a surplus of people to innovate, to do research and development on the one hand, and to staff this new technology on the other hand. And these kind of tendencies have been reinforced by changes in corporate governance, so that increasingly the boards of directors of major corporations come from outside the business unit. And the result of that is they really don't have an insider's view of where technology is going. They're not in a good position to make independent judgment. And so they kind of use a standard, which is what's everybody else doing. And if you're not opening a factory in China, you have to explain it to your board. But if you're opening a factory there, the board does not demand an explanation. So again, to underscore the point, innovation is a self-fulfilling, tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, what about knowledge? When we talk about knowledge these days, we're almost exclusively concerned with formal knowledge. Knowledge that's acquired in separate educational institutions through separate courses. What is missing in this view of knowledge is something which is, the kind of name that sticks in my mind is tacit knowledge. It's knowledge that's acquired kind of in practice. In the working world, it's acquired in the process of production. It's knowledge which, according to Michael Polanyi, who really is the kind of guru of tacit knowledge, it's things we know but can't say. How to ride a bicycle, how to recognize a face. And it is embedded in a community of people. So it's very much a communal outcome. And it's something that's shared by a community. I think of it as like a language. Language has you can reduce a language to a dictionary, and you can reduce it to a grammar. But people don't learn language that way, and they don't use language that way. They learn it in practice. And you can't really learn a language by reading a dictionary. And language is communal. It's something which is shared by a community. So there is this, at least one other clear part of language, of knowledge, a very different kind of knowledge than we think of when we think about adjusting, if you will, to the changes in the environment. But we don't really know very much about that alternative form of knowledge. When we talk about professional occupations, we in fact call it clinical knowledge. So the problem is, first, it's a part of knowledge, of knowing that is that we don't really recognize, and that we particularly don't recognize in relation to the frameworks in which we've been thinking about this problem. But it's also a kind of knowledge which the way in which institutions are evolving seems to be more and more difficult to acquire in this automatic kind of way. So increasingly, the firm which once, or the business unit which was once a community of people with different talents but who had together a common view of the world. Increasingly, these kind of, to use a term that goes back to my graduate training, in these internal labor markets are becoming fragmented. And my colleague, David Weil, calls it fiesuring. It's a kind of subcontracting to units which often are treated as independent contractors, but that operate outside of the kind of community that used to transfer knowledge from one generation of workers to another, so that the people who don't have access to formal education are becoming increasingly isolated from each other and from the production process, and the mechanisms which gave them an alternative view of the world. So knowledge, we have an overly restricted view of what knowledge is, and a view which increasingly makes it difficult to prescribe for those people who don't have the kind of formal education which underlies our understanding of what it is to be a knowledgeable person. And finally, let me say a word about entrepreneurship. The notion of entrepreneurship is really tied up in the idea that innovation is produced by particularly creative people. And it's a notion, in addition, for those of you who are economists, that has been developed that is kind of embedded in our thinking through the works of Joseph Schumpeter. And Schumpeter thought that the social world was very conservative, and it was very resistant to change. And that change, and by change he meant what we now think of as innovation, you had to have somebody who came in and pushed through the conservatism of a social setting. And by extension, those people then deserve special rewards for breaking through the conservatism of the society. And pushing new technologies. And so that vision of entrepreneurship is part of the justification, I think, an increasingly important part of the justification for the increasing inequality of income, which seems to characterize particularly the United States, but most industrial or post-industrial societies. But there's another view of innovation, which actually I see it because I've been working on a series of projects, one looking at innovation in research and development in private firms, another looking at Defense Department agency, DARPA, which is responsible for a number of breakthrough innovations, including the web and the GPS and a variety of military technologies. And in those views of innovation, in order to develop a new territory, you first have to create a community of people who share a common language and a common way of thinking about the world. And the way you create that community, both in the private sector and in the public sector, is to create an environment which is sheltered from competition, where people just get together and talk. So the cellular telephone comes out of the marriage of radio technology and engineering technology. And you couldn't get two more distant ways of looking at the world. So radio technology is the radio engineers are kind of cowboys. The signal fades in and out, and they love the excitement of trying to get the signal to fade back in. They're sort of like the people who are arranging all these devices on me to give this lecture, so we don't have a lot of static. Telephone engineers, on the other hand, have a they engineer everything to perfection. Everything is carefully laid out. They're a series of anal personalities getting together to preserve the technology. And those two kind of completely antagonistic intellectual traditions had to get together and somehow learn to work together in order to produce this device that now dominates communication across the globe. And the way that was done was by creating, within these major companies where this technology emerged, in AT&T, in Motorola, in Mitsubishi, and so on, each one of those companies separately created a sheltered space within the company where they were not, where the engineers were not subject to the pressure of competition, and where all they did for 2 or 3 years was talk to each other and play around until they had developed a kind of community of practice. And that same process of getting people to talk to each other and just exchange ideas and exchange visions in a world that was sheltered from competition is also true of the way in which the Defense Department of the United States has pushed towards these technological breakthroughs. So the lesson is not that individuals don't play a role or that it doesn't take a creative person in order to create new technologies, but it suggests that the process of innovation involves both community and competition, and that the vision of technology, which emerges from the Silicon Valley consensus with its emphasis on what this term entrepreneurship, really is missing a whole piece of the underlying process which produces new ideas and translates new ideas into marketable commodities in the economy. So there you have an idea of what it is that the Silicon Valley consensus is about and what it isn't. It highlights certain limited aspects of the economic process, but it completely obscures other aspects of the economic process. And it leads, particularly combined with globalization, to the idea of inevitability in the evolution of the economy, and leads us to ignore, in many ways, those aspects of economic development, which are, in a sense, ultimately, which have been tearing the economy, the polity in the United States apart. And I think it's not just true. It may, whether or not it's true in Australia, I leave it to you to ponder. But I was been reminded of this periodically in the last couple of years, and in the most dramatic way was when I was traveling in Ecuador, and I was at a conference, and I was driven in a car, in a private car, through the mountains to the old Spanish cities where tourists went, who after they finished their conference, and we were in this car, and the whole 3-hour trip, the radio was playing, and the vice president of Ecuador was giving a speech, and the speech was about innovation, entrepreneurship, and the knowledge economy. And here is a world which is totally removed, where you drive along in the mountains and you pass peasants with these exotic costumes leading llamas along the road. And the distance between modern society and the society which presumably the political class and the vice president is attempting to help develop is enormous, and yet there's the same vocabulary and the same notion of what it is that takes, that drives economic change. So the implication of that is we need a new way of, a more open way of looking at the world in which we live. But there's another element in all of this, I think, that that is notable in the way in which we've adjusted to these structural changes. And that is a way that it is much more consistent with the kind of conventional economics that I was taught as a graduate student. We still teach that if you're going to justify structural changes of the kind that we've been experiencing in American society in the last 30 years, that you need to make sure that the social benefits from those changes are greater than the social cost. It's a kind of elementary lesson. And actually, we teach a stronger proposition than that. You not only have to have more benefits than costs, but the people who are the gainers in the process should compensate the losers. And if you look at what's happened in American society over the last 30 years, there's been no compensation. There isn't even a place in the social system or the economic system where there are institutions which calculate the gains and compare them to the losses, let alone institutions that ensure that the compensation be paid out. And so it's we don't have an institutional structure which enables us even to think about the kind of processes that the Midwest of the country was reacting against when they voted for Trump. Not only don't we have the mechanisms for anticipating these changes, but if we were to anticipate them and we were to try and fulfill this obligation of this that is imposed by benefit cost analysis, we wouldn't really know what to do. Because if you look at what happened in the Midwest, it's not just that people were displaced by technological change or displaced by globalization. It's that whole communities were destroyed. That is, when you take away the manufacturing employment from these communities, you can't support any of the other economic institutions. So that the people who were essentially displaced by these changes, many of them were a very long way from the changes themselves. So the notion that you were going to compensate people directly affected by these changes really doesn't address at all the kind of communities and effects which are taking place. But I would go further than that. I think even for those people who we can identify as displaced, we really don't have the mechanisms. We don't know how to that is, we talk about adjustment assistance, but we don't really know how to adjust. We don't have the educational technologies which enable us to move people to wholly do occupations and places in the economy late in life. So that the problem of displacement is one that is almost impossible to really address, let alone solve, after the changes have taken place. And it points toward the need to develop ways of anticipating what those changes are likely to be and how fast they're likely to come. And in my mind, the greatest failing of the discourse, particularly about globalization, but also about technological change, is it's been presented as an all or nothing proposition. Either you're for globalization or you're against it. And the question of the timing which it takes place, whether you're going to move towards an open economy over 30 years or over 2 years, is never really broached. So if you take, for example, the factory system in Bangladesh, which collapsed, one of the biggest industrial accidents of the modern age. What was going on in those factories? The buildings were inspected. They didn't pass inspection, but the factories didn't. They stayed there until the building collapsed. Well, the underlying problem is one of real estate. These factories had no place to go. They were pushed into these kind of marginal buildings because they couldn't find real estate in safer places in the city. And that, in turn, was a product of the fact that we eliminated the multi-fiber agreement almost overnight. And instead of gradually moving towards a new equilibrium, we forced an adjustment to happen immediately. And so the question of timing became critical to exactly how this change was going to play itself out. So there's the problem. What's the lesson? Well, the underlying lesson, it seems to me, is we need a new way of thinking about the economy. We need a new policy paradigm. We need to, we need, in my mind, to move back at least to the spirit of Keynesian economics. which, in a sense, was this what justified, certainly in the post-war period, the industrial relations system of modern societies. It was built upon the idea that is what Keynesian, that is to say what Keynes actually said would be a difficult task. But the spirit of Keynesianism, the spirit of the Keynesian paradigm was that you could design new institutions which would address underlying problems of society. It wasn't that you had to align yourself with an inevitable direction of technology. It wasn't that you had to align yourself with an inevitable direction of the market. That human beings could design the institutions that govern society. So there's one theme, however, that it does seem to me all of these kind of limitations of the Silicon Valley consensus point to. And that is that we need to recognize the role of community in the way in which society operates. We need to recognize that the essential human characteristic is one of language. That's what distinguishes us from the rest of the world, if you will. And language is a communal resource. And it's something that only develops in the relationship that people have with each other. And that notion of having a communal relationship is critical to the way in which technology evolves and takes place. And it's critical to the way in which we learn. It's critical to the development of new institutions. So we need a paradigm, a policy paradigm, if you will, that recognizes this aspect of human beings and this aspect of the economy. I wish that I could offer you that paradigm as a conclusion, but I can't. But I do think that it's pretty clear the direction in which we need to move. And when I think, just to end, about the failures of the way we've thought about this in the past, I'm reminded of the fact that we've come to think in the United States of the last administration, the Obama administration, as being a model of which the current administration is a reaction. But if you look at the end of the Obama administration, they negotiated 2 enormous trade treaties on the day before the election. One in terms of the Pacific Basin, the other with the European Union. And at the very moment that a reaction was setting in that was about to shake up in a fundamental way the American political structure, we reinforced the direction of structural change, or we tried to reinforce it, that was driving people away from the existing economic and political strategy. And that, I think, was because we were so sure that in order to have economic progress, you had to ally yourself with the basic forces of technology. And in the end, I'm reminded of this period looks more than anything else like the interwar period before the Second World War. At that time, if you looked at policy paradigms there were two enormous policy paradigms which were fighting out the future of all of these societies. One was Marxism, which was a technological determinism, a different technology than that, which is deterministic in the Silicon Valley consensus, but in the spirit of the way you think about the economy, really the same thing. And the other was a market determinism that was basically a kind of Hayekian view of the world. So we don't have either one of those paradigms left. In a way, we're lucky. We have an open book, and we can write, hopefully, a new paradigm. But on the other hand, we're not sure where to go and where to look. So it's a critical moment, not just politically, but intellectually, I think. And the challenge is for those of us, particularly in the academy, but hopefully in the larger society as well, the challenge is to try and develop innovations in ideas that will enable us to face the world which we now find ourselves living. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. A little bit pessimistic, but a glimmer of optimism right there towards the end, perhaps. There are roving microphones, so if you've got a question, can I ask you to raise your hand, and I'll get a microphone to come to you. There's one, an early mover over there. Can I ask you to give us your name and ask your question? Thank you.
Hi there. I'm also named Michael, because everyone in North America is named Mike. I just wondered, Professor Piora, if you think there's any countries, when you mentioned this mechanism and compensation that you think is required to help with the direction of compensation for the losers of the system, if you want to call them that, do you think there's any countries doing this well, or if not, like who's doing it the best?
Well, I don't know all the countries of the world. But the countries that I know, I'm very skeptical of. Denmark. That is the programs that I am told are the greatest successes are programs which basically try and deal with people after they've been displaced from employment. And I guess I'm more concerned that we develop institutions in which people don't get displaced. And I'm kind of skeptical that the successful programs of adjustment are programs which basically put people through an altogether new professional training. So they're programs which aren't 3 months or 4 months, but they're 3 and 4 years. And so I'm skeptical that we really have the capacity to change, that is, to compensate for the results of the market, so to speak.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I really appreciate you coming down here to University of Melbourne to give it. What I was wondering is, it seems a lot of the problems that you've talked about so far have to do with a miscalculation in how the economy is naturally running. That when the economy was chasing sort of its equilibrium state, it was leaving in its wake a lot of social harm without really having social benefit. And to me, that almost seems like that's saying that the calculus by which the economy says where should resources be, who should be considered, is broken. And when you look at sort of how in our market-based system, that looks towards assigning how much weight somebody's will has, how much somebody's desires to be met, how much weight that has is proportional to how much wealth or income they have, which is their market power. And if that is giving a miscalculus because it's not considering more people within that, it seems almost that the solution to that would be something that brings negotiation power, which is what the market is really aiming to do. It's negotiation. And to bring negotiation to the masses, to labour, to the manufactories of the Midwest, in ways that are less individualistic. And so I was wondering what your opinion is on unions and worker ownership, hot topics at the moment, in terms of fixing this miscalculus and in terms of bringing a collective element to this hyper-individualism. Thank you so much.
Well, I think unions, if they could, I just lost a microphone here. If we could figure out a way of protecting unions, I think, I mean, let me put it in a different sense. There are two ways in which one can think of how to address this problem, or three ways. One, clearly, is we need an intellectual structure for thinking about it. But second of all, we would like to design institutions which make these calculations and concerns inherent in the structure of society. We don't really want to be in a position to pick up the pieces after the game is played out. And if one thinks of the kinds of institutions which might have that effect, one of them is certainly trade unions. And one of the reasons I think that we've gotten into such problems, particularly in the Midwest, of the United States, is the decline of effective union representation, not simply in the workplace, but in the political process. But I don't really think unions are going to be enough. And I think we need to think about other kinds of institutions that might have similar effects. And to begin to talk about what those institutions might look like is almost another whole discussion. But I think that the new political forces which have emerged and again, I speak for my own country, I can't really generalize. The new political forces which have emerged are forces that are associated with disadvantaged and disadvantaged groups, ethnic groups, women, minorities, and so on. And so I think the question is there some way of building these new groups into institutions which will address the economic problems? Up to now, these are not institutions which have been really centered on economic problems. They've and the question and that is one of the things which really distinguishes them from trade unions. But there's certainly groups which are achieving much more power in the society at the same time that the power of trade unions is declining.
So to follow on from that, we think about, I suppose, the rise of activism around environmental issues, and they're increasingly converging with debates around economic futures and so on. So in line with what you're suggesting, is there, do you think, a possibility that those types of social movements provide a vehicle through which you get this innovation, this institutional innovation?
Well, the environmental movement came after you were born. In a deep sense, okay, I mean, if you go to Karl Polanyi, in a deep sense, human beings live in a place, and the ability to realize yourself as a human being depends on preserving that place. And community is not just an abstraction, it's something which is located in a particular situation. So I think there is a sense in which the environmental movement is part of a movement which is tends to recognize the communal nature of the problems which we face, the world in which we're living in. But I'm not sure that I'm the one to provide exactly the bridge between those two organizational movements.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor. My question is just around the institutions and trying to conceptualise them. I'm just trying to get an idea of some institutions that might exist today. What do they look like? If they don't exist today, what are some of the signs we can look for to say in 5, 10, 20 years' time, that's the institution the Professor was speaking about back in 2019? What are the critical elements of these institutions?
That is a really good, a good question. I think what you'd have to do to address this question is to understand something which I'm not sure anybody really understands, and that is the evolution of cities and the distribution of people across space. Cities are becoming increasingly important, I think, as institutions. But at the same time, they're becoming increasingly part of the upper part of the income distribution. And so in order to make cities a force which essentially deals with the social problems which the country faces, I think you have to somehow address this problem of how you could have how you could be developing a kind of a structure of living space which is so segregated by income, if you will. And I think that's a problem which we're just beginning to recognize, let alone address. That's not a real answer to your question, but that's the best I can do at this point.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Gabriella, and my background is in workplace law and industrial relations. And I found that there are many articles about the future of work and artificial intelligence. And would it be correct to say that in the past few decades, the new technology displaced those employees who were either semi-skilled or unskilled, and now when the positions or the work of middle class and more skilled and educated people is in danger, there will be a more emphasis on how to move forward from here?
Well, I think that the idea that technology is inevitably moving to favor the highly educated, I think it's implicit in what I said before, that I don't to buy that. I think that the direction in which technology moves is partly, maybe mainly, a product of the direction in which we push technology. And if you look at, say, defense research in the United States, but we've just opened, that is, here we are in the United States engaged in a debate about the future of work. It's all over the place. It's not a coordinated debate, but everybody has a horse in the game, and the general feeling is that that we're eliminating low-skilled, jobs for the low-skilled and low-educated workers. We have a big project on the future of work at MIT, and we've been visiting a lot of industrial plants, particularly in Ohio, because that just for a variety of specific reasons. There's no sign in those plants that work is disappearing. There's very little use of this high technology. There's certainly not. There's almost no robots. So that part of this idea that we're moving towards tomorrow into this new world doesn't really square with what, I mean, the trouble with kind of observations of this kind is you didn't look around the corner, you didn't look in the, we looked at Ohio, but we didn't look at Michigan and so on. So I don't think that observation is determining. But nonetheless, it doesn't, the change in technology does not seem to be happening overnight. If you look at what direction technology is moving in, it's as I said before, it's partly, maybe mainly, a result of where you look for technology. At the moment, in the midst of this scare about jobs disappearing, we in the United States have created 10 new manufacturing institutes, which are supposed to be doing research in a direction which is likely to eliminate even more jobs. Why are we doing that? Because there's this kind of fear that if we don't do it, we're going to lose the manufacturing. We're going to lose even more manufacturing than we already have. If you really take seriously the concern about the future of work, you would be a lot more receptive to things like protection, tariff protection and kind of restrictions on foreign trade that would preserve the jobs. And then if you look at technology more broadly, look at I mean, I've never ridden the subway here in Melbourne, but at least in Boston, if you ride the subway, everybody has a cellular phone. And education does not appear to be an obstacle to using that technology. And if you look at the evolution of computer technology in general, there's been a movement over time towards building interfaces between the human and the machine, which make the machine more accessible to human beings with minimal levels of technical background. So I'm not at all convinced that there's that work is coming to an end, even as in 30 years perhaps. But and like I said, I think that if we allocate resources towards making technology more accessible to less educated workers, that we're likely to forestall a movement towards, quote, the end of work.
On that note, I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questions, but can we please thank Professor Piore for his lecture. Thanks, Michael. Well done.